Welcome to both Success and Integrity with Bessi Graham, a podcast dedicated to established business leaders like you, ready to bring more meaning into your life in a way that strengthens rather than threatens the financial stability of your business. I'm your host, Bessi Graham. I've worked with business owners, governments, and large funding bodies like the United Nations for over 20 years to bring doing good and making money back together. So let's unpack why you don't have to choose between experiencing success or having integrity in your life. So our focus in the episode today is going to be around seeing what we as business leaders can learn from the places where commercial opportunity and sustainability converge. And so to help us explore that topic, I have a wonderful friend, Noah Beckwith, joining us. Noah is a private equity and investment specialist working across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And so he brings a really genuine global perspective to this conversation, which I think is really important. With advisory mandates with some of the biggest names like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Clinton Foundation, Bank of America, Asian Development Bank, and the Foreign Affairs departments in both the UK and Australia, Noah's input has shaped the fund design, structuring, and management of many a portfolio. And his extraordinary mind is matched only by what I would say is his wicked sense of humour, which I have given you a little heads up, Noah, and said, that we'll keep that sense of humour in check today in our conversation. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me.
It's been far too long. We met, I can't actually even remember what year it was, but
6 years ago.
Yeah, years ago in doing a project with the Australian government together.
Absolutely.
But hopefully we can do another project at some point. But great to have you here with us today. And I'm really looking forward to one of the things, Noah, that I often talk to business leaders about is the need for us to think like a system and act like an entrepreneur. And I'm hoping that in this conversation, you can help us really stretch and just look at things from a different perspective, zoom out a bit and see what are those risks, what are those opportunities that business leaders need to be looking at in order to actually have ongoing and sustainable success over time. So I'm wondering if you could first just give us a bit of an introduction and a whirlwind tour of your experience in this place of where business and finance kind of intersect in that opportunity to actually do good and make money.
To start to get specific in terms of the convergence between the sustainability side, and that word really takes hold. Not that it didn't exist, but it really starts to take hold, I would say in the late 90s and early 2000s, as the urgency of, resource depletion and then environmental matters comes to the fore. The convergence starts to come, I think, in this notion that solutions at scale, particularly, we can discuss other size solutions and other strategies, but solutions at scale should, and in the hands of some observers, must be profitable and very profitable if they are going to obtain and continue to grow and indeed solve the issues that they're purporting to solve. But I think importantly, what has been mainstreamed is this notion that there is absolutely nothing wrong with, and indeed from a commercial and business DNA perspective, in many cases, if the sustainability angle is not embedded interwoven into the growth thesis and the commercial objective, then there's a real problem, or there may be problems down the road. That's certainly where I sit on that spectrum of I would say orthodoxy around this issue.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important contextual piece to sort of frame that development over a significant period of decades of work that has been going on, which I think often in that commercial space or with businesses, this notion of starting to consider things like ESG and different pressures or compliance requirements that are coming onto them is quite new. And one of the pieces that I'm keen for us to unpack a little bit today is the fact that we can, if we look at the historical aspects around some of these components related to the investment side and the types of due diligence that were done and the results that were achieved, we can learn lessons from that and now get ahead of it in terms of as businesses, that if we just ignore all of that contextual piece, we miss a bunch of learnings. You mentioned an interesting piece there, which I think I have certainly seen a shift in the last few years around things that have historically been seen by business as an externality, not their problem, they don't need to consider it, are suddenly being seen very directly as the responsibility of a business. I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about that and maybe give us some examples even of, from the investment side, from those appetites you're seeing in different international markets. What are the pieces that now a business cannot see as an externality that they once could?
I mean, again, if I can sort of zoom the lens out, and you started around, the systemic piece, but I think zooming the lens out is important here insofar as framing that question and more broadly, ESG, very crudely into two buckets, if you like. So you've used words like compliance and externalities and responses to those externalities, and I think that's one large bucket, which is external pressure from all sorts of sources, in some cases internal, around behavior, around the nature of inputs that go into outputs, the outcomes, and then the impacts on society, on the environment, et cetera, et cetera. And so we'll come back to that. Just to name the second bucket, I think the second bucket is really around deliberate, intentional, either business models or policies within businesses to affect change. And I think it is a really critical distinction because, to be slightly cynical about it, so back to bucket one, there is a lot of frantic cleaning up, in some cases whitewashing, greenwashing, et cetera, that is very much a response to external pressure. To some extent understandable, to some extent not exactly a bad dynamic. By all means, let's stop dumping whatever into rivers or reduce our emissions, et cetera, et cetera. There's the whole piece which we haven't even touched on about how you analyze that, measure it, report it, and so on. But just to, again, sort of declare where I am on all of this, what I would love to see, in addition to that long overdue clearing up piece and reactive business posture to this sort of pressure, is a more active piece, which then also, to my mind, really splits into three buckets, if I may. I mean, one is, stopping doing certain things or withdrawing from certain things. So, what's traditionally known in our sector as do no harm. The other is, if you like, cleaning house. So it's, if you think of an organism or a cell and all of those cells around it, it's how, you deal with your own organism and cells. So, the workers and the conditions and so on and so forth. And then around you, the supply chain, society, et cetera. And, that's what people crudely may refer to, we've made certain ESG improvements and so on and so forth. The piece that, again, I must confess, I'm most interested in are the active policies, either in the sense of what the business is producing or the way in which it's engaging with suppliers or consumers or distributors or producers, or bringing in actors into those supply and value chains in a way that drives value. And I think that's where we are still struggling enormously to enlighten the business community that there is inherent commercial value in pursuing these strategies, as opposed to either bucket one of those two, which is the urgent cleanup, and some of the other buckets. So there, I think there's still a lot of work to do. I mean, funnily enough, I was just with a financial institution in Geneva yesterday, and it was a very sort of anodyne. We know this is sort of coming down the pike. We need to look at what we've done in the past and, what we do about this. It's very, very reactive, as opposed to a much more exciting conversation, which is what can our finance do in this realm, and how can it put pain? Not because we want to be seen to be doing that. There is that piece. Fine, take the marketing position around it, but because there's value in it. That's the critical. Yeah.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. And that shift is the piece that I am most interested in business leaders having, which in my mind is really the mindset shift. So there's the piece that, as you said, a lot of people have been talking about this for a long time, but around the impact measurement and management space, the impact management project, now impact management platform, their ABC model of that, initially avoid harm, then how do you benefit stakeholders? How do you contribute to solutions? How do you move up that piece? And like you, I am very much in the camp that I want people to, start with that avoiding harm, begin the process. But the opportunities here, and certainly the components where I would say you actually can see doing good as a competitive edge that your business has been missing, is to dive into this fully and actually do that work to grapple with your business model. And I think part of what you're saying is that same piece, that if business leaders can start to move beyond the fear and reactionary response to this and instead see that opportunity, there's incredible things that can happen. And there was a piece, so I had a look at a report that you wrote, Inclusive Business Financing, back in 2018. And in that you were talking about the shift from, I think it was 2004 when The Fortune of the Bottom of the Pyramid came out. So we're nearly 20 years away from that. But you talked about the fact that started this process of shifting in our minds the role of, for want of a better word, the poor, and seeing this market opportunity that actually existed there. But you then spoke in that report about the shift in what I would say is actually a power dynamic shift, to say, not only is it a market opportunity, but if we take this approach that says, let's broaden out the stakeholders we're considering here, from just a focus on a shareholder to actually looking at our suppliers, our team or employees, the components related to the communities that we operate in, the customers themselves. If we broaden that out, that piece, I think, is a really helpful way to start to look at and examine in a different way, where are these opportunities? Where does risk sit? And so it is both a beautiful thing in terms of shifting a power dynamic, but it is, I think, one of the pieces that needs to occur in our thinking as business leaders to start to take into account these broader perspectives. I wonder, have you seen, even since you wrote that report, so in the last sort of 5 years or so, have you seen some shifts in momentum around people starting to tap into and engage with this broader group of stakeholders in positive ways?
Absolutely. And to be honest, with no criticism intended, I mean, I don't know that I would put it in terms of, merrily engaging with this broader group of stakeholders. And I say that in the following vein. I say that in the vein of, sadly, as human beings, it tends to be, the urgency that drives us. And then we look for, either sticks or carrots or both. And so if I can give an example, which may seem slightly far afield, but I think it's quite helpful, and it's sort of mentioned in that publication, which is Mongolia. So and what I'm going to try to do here is to sort of draw out, how all of these, the environmental, the poverty related, so the economic and the socio-cultural and so on, the social, they all converge. So, broad brush, we all have voracious and unsustainable demand for cadmia. You have 80 million animals on land that can only carry 20 million largely because of our demand. It's destroying the path we landed is accelerating desertification, and you now have 3/4 of the population, which used to be largely nomadic, centered and living in often horrible conditions, very political conditions in the capital, Ulaanbaatar. So if we dissect that, if we unpack that, what's actually going on? The conversation that I'm now having as I put together an investment strategy to try to address this is, let's take the cashmere companies. In 10 years' time, stripping out the human, the environmental, all that side of things, you will not have this fabric anymore. It's just not possible because there's no pastureland for these animals to eat at the simplest level. If you are interested in changing that, we are giving you an opportunity to invest in a vehicle which will, and here comes the stakeholders piece, which will invest in the producers of cashmere, the manufacturers, the dyers, etc., in ways that create much more sustainable relationships with those suppliers, so the herders, not because it is a nice thing to do. And this is the crucial distinction. Yes, it's a nice thing to do, although that sounds terribly condescending, but because unless you strengthen that relationship, unless you start to pay them reliable, dependable wages in return for quality product. And in this case, there's a wonderful convergence because the only way you can increase the quality of the cashmere is by reducing the size of the herd, which of course starts to help the pastureland regenerate. Then, you're not going to have any cashmere. So that to me is a wonderful sort of convergence and a sort of the light bulb goes off in their minds. Now look, if Laura Piana and Prada and whatever want to take the publicity position in their shops as they're selling a £2,000 jumper around, this is the village that we're helping, I've made peace with that. Some people find, whatever, we shouldn't waste time talking about it, but that's how I think business can be very effectively engaged. It is in their interest. And there's a big distinction to be drawn between that and, much scarier sticks like, fossil fuels industry, you can no longer exist. That's a whole other discussion which I don't think you want to get into today. But I recognize that these are areas that are perhaps a little bit less black and white, emotive, and easier, as it were, to perhaps think creatively about.
Well, I think too, it takes us back to that aspect of thinking like a system, acting like an entrepreneur. So it's the piece of, and I do see it being connected to this shift in us needing to start to take account for all of the flow-on effects of our decisions. So that zooming out a bit and saying, the pieces that maybe over my career, if this was 50 years ago, I could have got away with my business continuing to scale and grow at the site that, at the pace that it is currently without addressing these issues. By zooming out and actually taking a realistic look at what is going to affect the future sustainability of your organisation, you will realise that longer term vision means you have to start behaving differently now. And as you said, not simply because it's the right thing to do, but because it actually makes commercial sense. And this piece to me is where we're going to get the type of change that we need to have happen when that actually sinks in. Because at any point while this stays in the category of a nice to have or just a marketing piece, when push comes to shove, we won't make the right decisions to actually embed these practices and changes because it hasn't actually really got down to the alignment of the core business strategy to these particular areas. So I think...
But I think in fairness, to any business, it is important to point out two things. One is that there's not always such a beautiful, neat convergence in an ideal world of the Mongolia thesis. And secondly, there will come times where there are pressures. Let's take the supply chain emergencies or bottlenecks and things around COVID. And so, any business, as in any household, faces sometimes very, very difficult trade-offs between allocation of resources and so on. And I think that, again, track record is important here. Companies' relationships with their stakeholders are important there insofar as if if difficult decisions need to be made, at certain times, we can't all be perfect all of the time. We rarely are ever, but do you know what I mean? So that's where I think, the social media piece and the sort of rush to judgment and the trial by media is, can be, we just have to be aware of that.
Yeah. But also it does feel like we are at a point where there is starting to be this mix of different drivers all coming at the same time, in terms of we have some of those external pressures that you highlighted before, in terms of the pieces that are almost the negative sense of, regulatory pressures that we might just react to. But some of those can actually be things that incentivize the right behavior. So if you then have a company that isn't yet thinking about these things, and suddenly you've got changes coming in the EU, for example, around you won't actually be able to import if your products contribute to deforestation. It's like, well, if you now cannot sell in that market, if you haven't addressed these things, you will start to look at your supply chain differently. You will start, so that we can incentivize the right behavior. So we're having those types of shifts externally. I'm seeing, and I'm sure that you've got far more examples than me, but I'm seeing from an investor perspective, the questions that are being asked and the requirements in a due diligence space that are now not simply for things being considered as an impact investment, but they are just a standard question being asked of organisations, again, are starting to raise questions in a different way and incentivise the right behaviour. We have the same shifts occurring with the broader consumer market, asking us to not only answer these big questions, but back it up with the evidence that shows transparency, So it does feel like we're at a point that is quite different to a few years ago when there was lone voices saying this stuff. What's your sense of that? Are we at a really critical point?
I think we're at a critical point. I think there's a big distinction to be drawn between public companies and private companies. And in fact, again, a conversation that I was just having yesterday with the sort of banking community in Geneva was around exactly this, that as a shareholder of whatever size, but let's stick to sort of a minority size, even a significant minority stake. It can be very difficult to feel any direct relationship between these impulses that you might have sort of for and through and on behalf of, your participation in that company as a shareholder and what actually happens. Whereas in the private space, private equity, for example, or other forms of private investment, it's very, very different. And I think we still haven't cracked, we have these beautiful phrases like shareholder activism and so on, but unless you happen to be an 80% stake, shareholder in a company, I can really, crack the whip. I think that's really tough. And it so happens that some of the companies that we most need to move the needle are very, very large public companies. And depending on what country you're in, of course, that whole policy environment around, be it subsidies or favorable policy, that's where it becomes really, really complicated. And to be honest, I don't think we know what to do about that yet. I don't think we know how to deal with that. But systemically, yes. I mean, it feels as though something is slowly shifting. But I think it is true to say that it does still feel like it's shifting around that, no question, greater sense of responsibility and awareness that certain behaviors have to stop or certain investment activities have to stop, but more in the sense of once I do that, I'll be okay. As opposed to, I as a company, the company will be okay, as opposed to where are the value drivers here? And again, if I may, a slight sort of distraction. So 22 years ago now, when I was handed this thing, ESG, one of the things we struggled most with was explaining and sort of incentivizing our colleagues on the ground who had a portfolio of investments of, say, $2 to $10 million in small businesses around Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And what I quickly realized was it was only when the commercial light went off that they sat up and got interested. And I had no sticks to use in those days, other than the fact that maybe an investor might come and do an audit. And unsurprisingly, they tended to be, the Scandinavian investors and things that are far harder on these issues than we all tend to be, or were at the time. but it was, it was when you said, do you realize that this could really drive a very, very different delta, an exit, or this could seriously impact the company's P&L because of savings by actually no longer sourcing this or that or the other. That's when they suddenly sat up. So I still believe, imperfect and messy and ugly as it may be, it's that commercial imperative that generally is the purest in that, for want of a better word.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think part of the piece that I think many of us are trying to crack is how better to explain and position that competitive advantage that comes from having the genuine transition, the actual shift towards this being embedded in the core business. The other piece that I just want to pick up on, because you spoke about some of these challenges around, massive organisations where they are publicly listed and there's less of that lever of an individual business leader or owner being able to completely change the way that company is operating. For me, I very much see the place that I want to focus and that I think has a lot of potential is that small and medium enterprise space. It's the aspects around family businesses around the world, because they make up such a massive driver of the economy, such huge numbers in terms of the actual businesses that are out there. Yes, they're not at the size of the companies you're talking about, but if we go back to this mindset shift, when someone who actually is running a family-owned business or a small or medium enterprise has this transition in the way that they think, they can make a decision differently. They have decision-making rights. They have the ability to spend money differently or ask questions in their supply chain. And so, I know, again, in that piece that you wrote in 2018, you had a beautiful phrase where you talked about micro, small and medium enterprises. So right from the very small up to the medium size being this connective tissue that had the ability to reduce things like poverty and inequality. So I'm guessing that you are like me and kind of see the potential in that space as well as the big end of town. Is that still an area that you think could help drive some of this change?
Without question. I mean, I think there are numerous points on this. I mean, I think you're spot on. So absolutely, without question, we can't think about this without addressing the SME piece, where there's still, I think, a lot of thinking to do. And I think the development finance community did a very good job and then sort of retracted from it, but I hope is now re-entering is, these MSMEs in many, many environments, be it, Australia, UK or Laos, it is simply beyond your means. It's beyond your balance sheet to make all of the changes that you might otherwise. And I think it's a very salutary lesson to recall. Again, when I had sort of ESG landed on my plate, and I did some fascinating training courses. There's a brilliant man from the International Labour Organization who basically said, if I looked at my own organization, he was saying, let alone all of yours, there are 100 and I can't remember what the number was, but 17 conventions. I can guarantee you that what we're doing right now probably offends several of them. To bring in a little bit of humor, an anecdote, we once had a evaluator come into our fund in East Africa. This is when I was at a place called Aureus Capital. And he went around sort of announcing, this man was from Finland, announcing in a very, lovely, charming Scandinavian way that under ILO conventions, everyone was entitled to housing and all of these things. And of course, the next day at the office, there was a stampede of thousands of people expecting a house. Because technically, when you look at those conventions, I mean, I can't think of any company that lives up to that. But the point being that the scale of change needed as you go down the curve of business size, as against the resources that are often available.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering, you've used some great examples from a range of different countries. Are there particular regions or places that you think are ahead of the curve that we almost should be looking to as signals of what change is coming? So when we want to predict a little bit and anticipate change, which countries do you think are ahead in some of these areas?
I mean, different countries and regions, different areas in which they're ahead. I have never been so sort of blown away by the intersection between technology and specifically fintech and addressing these issues as India and Sri Lanka, to a lesser extent, I suppose, Bangladesh. But the way in which technology is being applied, I mean, just to give you a tiny example, one lender that's using heat mapping to help drive customers, and they only work in slums, towards denser areas where their kiosk may be able to sell more because there are more people sort of, buying their lunch, for want of a better way of describing the meal there or whatever, and cash collection, and it's very much a cash economy, how they're dealing with cash and collection, getting cash into those people's hands. And I mean, just utterly extraordinary, and risk assessment and analysis. Latin America to some extent as well on the fintech side. I think on the generally, I would say that Latin America and South Asia are the most advanced in that area to some extent in banking and what banking is doing. Although huge shout out to East Africa companies. Some of your listeners might have heard of like M-Pesa and so on. I mean, revolutionary ways of thinking about access to finance, mobile telephony, etc. I mean, it really, really varies. What I would say, though, in terms of the fund management community and the evolution of it and the development of it, and who's most cutting edge there, again, I think the awards definitely go to Latin America, India. China, curiously, is actually, this is strictly my opinion, quite far behind on that front. Southeast Asia is catching up. But yeah, those are the real areas of innovation. One thing that I also feel very strongly about, which is often a fairly painful message, and it doesn't go down very well, is that I think there are so many lessons to be applied, particularly from microfinance and inclusive finance, and how that relates to agriculture, healthcare, etc., to countries especially like the United States and the emerging markets within the United States, if I could put it that way, Deep South, Appalachia, the illegal migrant community and so on, parts of Europe, and others. I think that's a very, very painful thing to hear, though.
But again, I think if we can work through that discomfort, the piece that is useful, and it's one of the reasons why I'm keen to have your kind of global view of some of these things, is you use the word innovation, and obviously that word gets thrown around a lot by a lot of people who aren't actually being innovative. But in the context that you were just explaining it, one of the best ways that we can innovate and find genuine opportunities in the business space is to look elsewhere and see what they're doing and go, what could that look like in my particular business, or what could that look like in my region? And you've given us some really great examples there in a few different areas that are in places that to be honest, often there is an arrogance about where we look for lessons.
Absolutely.
And we kind of go, oh yes, so what's happening in Europe or what's happening in the US, and I love that the examples you've given and that the innovation that we could actually learn from and that could help us.
No, and just two examples, because I think examples help. I was once working on something on agriculture and agricultural value chains in the Deep South in the United States and in Appalachia, which, for people who might not be aware, is a long sort of mountainous stretch, the eastern United States, horribly, horribly poor, has been, ever since really it was settled. And two anecdotes. I mean, one where, people know a little bit about the geography of the US, where sort of Kentucky and Tennessee and so on meet a number of states. I think there's a bit of Virginia in there, 5 and 6 hours along dreadfully underinvested, depending on the weather, muddy or snowy tracks to get your milk to a collection center. This is no different to rural Cambodia. And then in the Deep South, and equally, worrying, if much more sort of painful example of an African-American farmer, 60 years old, from a farming family, curiously had applied for a loan 50 times as a woman and African American and had never quite managed to get a loan. So unfortunately, these things happen all over the world. Now, what's going on in that situation? If we dissect it a little bit further, financial institutions are missing out on a huge opportunity. If you want to just look at the commercial, agricultural efficiency, the ability to some of our earlier conversations start to bring in less damaging inputs, the ability of that person and their family to get access to those things is all being subjugated to the very same access or affordability or discrimination or exclusion issues that we see all over the world. And so that's where I think, the onus is always on us to look, in every country, where these unfortunate dynamics obtain, because generally, no matter what the sociocultural dimension is, what they're doing is they're actually keeping us from opportunity and keeping us from greater efficiencies that can address particularly these environmental issues and social issues. So, yeah.
Yeah, they're deeply connected. And I think that is one of the pieces that as we start to realize that, if we actually come at these things and think about how would we address that, it then creates this beautiful mutually reinforcing cycle that in improving those outcomes, we actually increase the financial sustainability of our actual operations of the core business, like that they are connected, which I think we so often miss. And we so often miss, and this is something that many people that you and I have worked with over decades now end up being the worst contributors to, because they come in and have these purist, naive conversations that it's all about what people should be doing and doing it because it's the right thing to do. And they actually lose that audience because they have failed to point out that this is a deeply nuanced and complex conversation that is far more than just doing good from that selfless way. Leading on from that, if you think about the businesses themselves, whether they're a family business or a small and medium enterprise anywhere in the world that is thinking about this shift to start to take more responsibility for their actual operations and for the flow-on impacts of that, what are some of the sort of predictions or things that you would say are changes that are coming that they need to be conscious and aware of?
The least interesting and most mundane bit of the answer, but an important one is, this is coming, and more you're going to find yourself excluded. Depending on what market you're in, sooner or later it's going to get tougher. I'm going to jump in there.
Can you, when you say this is coming, are you talking about the broader aspects of being able to account for the environmental, social governance kind of pieces, or what is this?
Sorry, that was very badly expressed. What this is the juggernaut of what you've just mentioned, or it could be on the reporting side, or it could be on the sort of there's some very important things in there. You can't dump this in the river anymore. To greater or lesser extent, it's that juggernaut is coming down the motorway very, very fast, which is broadly a good thing. But I think that again, from the business's perspective, to the extent that we can help foster greater awareness, and this is with absolutely no judgment intended, of the range of responses to these shifts that are possible. So again, and I really want to hammer home this point of no judgment. There is absolutely nothing wrong with a business that, as a result of these dynamic shifts, says, what we used to use this much plastic and we used to emit this much carbon or whatever. We've changed that and now we don't. And that's absolutely fine. All the way through to this, to me, is just, far more interesting. Businesses that either begin to see opportunity in or see new opportunities within how they engage with their broader stakeholder community, suppliers, producers, et cetera, and so, what they're making and who it's available to, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And I think as people are, thinking about these big topics that we've explored today, I think that aspect of reminding yourself that we're framing this in a big system, but that what we're asking you to do is then drill that down to the pieces that you actually have some influence and control over. Because otherwise it is all too overwhelming, and we will stay in situations where we'll say, well, that's nice, but until there is an external investor or funder who wants to pay for this, I'm not going to prioritize it. Or, there's always an excuse for why we can't do something. So what I don't want people to do is to take the hugeness of this conversation and then feel overwhelmed and do nothing. But remember that it is context that can now inform your decisions and actually set you up to run your business better moving forward. And part of the piece, Noah, that you've sort of just explained to us that I think is really useful is that if we think about how we might want to begin that journey, there are the components that really are about external pressures, the reacting or responding to the compliance and regulation that is coming at us. And that can sit simply in that category of beginning by assessing what you're currently doing and working towards the avoid harm category. But the piece that I think both Noah and I are really hoping people are catching on to is that the opportunities, the pieces that will bring innovation, that will open up new markets and new ways to operate, that will genuinely position you to have that competitive advantage, only come when you move beyond that surface level ticking of a box and you really shift into thinking differently about all of the ways that you're running your business, about whose position you take into account when you design something or when you produce a new product. And so my hope is that as people listen to this and reflect on it, that part of what can become exciting is this genuinely moving away from a fear-based reaction to risk and into a genuine movement towards innovation and opportunity. Thank you so much, Noah. I really appreciate it.
I really enjoyed it.
It's great to have such an international view. Again, I think so often the examples we hear and the voices that are the loudest are not representative of what's happening in the world. So I'm really thankful for your time.
Pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.